Good evening. Welcome to the 2024 Peter Tobin Oration. My name is Steve Martin. I'm from ABC in Ballarat and I'm your MC for this evening. The Peter Tobin Oration is presented annually to mark the anniversary of the Eureka Stockade. The event is named in honour of Peter Tobin, OAM, and celebrates his significant contribution to the commemoration of the stockade. This year's oration has the topic of why Eureka Matters. It's a very timely theme given some of the challenges that we've seen facing global democracies. Very soon we're going to welcome our guest speakers. It's Peter FitzSimons and AM, I should say, and Professor Clare Wright, OAM. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce the Mayor of the City of Ballarat, Councillor Tracy Hargraves, to welcome you all and pay tribute to the late Peter Tobin AM. Please welcome the Mayor.
Thank you so much, Steve. Welcome everyone. As Steve said, I'm your brand new mayor, apparently, of the whole 2.5 weeks now, Tracy Hargraves, so councillor for the Delacombe ward and mayor of the City of Ballarat. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather tonight on Wadawurrung country. I pay my respects to Wadawurrung elders past and present and recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways. The City of Ballarat also includes the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I would like to acknowledge John and Bridget Mulholland. John was recently the CEO at Laois County Council in Ireland. The City of Ballarat has a cultural accord with the Laois County Council, and to foster connections between the Eureka Centre and Peter Lalor's birthplace, Tentacle House. I'd also like to acknowledge received apologies from the Honourable Catherine King MP, Federal Member for Ballarat, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government, Michaela Settle, Member for Eureka, Parliamentary Secretary for Agriculture and Parliamentary Secretary for Regional Development, and Joe McCracken MP, Member for Western Victoria Region. I'd also like to really warmly welcome members of the Peter Tobin family, especially Marie Harrison, Michael Tobin, Bernard Tobin, Paula Tobin, who are joining us this evening for this event, named in honour of their father, Peter Tobin OAM. How special is that? And of course, our guest speakers, Peter FitzSimons AM and Professor Clare Wright OAM. Very warm welcome to Ballarat to all of you. We gather here today to mark the 170th anniversary of the Eureka Stockade. Eureka continues to intrigue and engage people. It is such a significant part of our identity in Ballarat. It's had a major impact on the Australian identity in general and the very character of our democracy. An important part of our Eureka commemorative program is the Peter Tobin Oration. The late Peter Tobin OAM was passionate about Eureka and worked tirelessly to ensure that it was remembered. At a time when interest in Eureka was in decline, he kept its spirit alive. Peter worked tirelessly to advance the commemoration of Eureka, and throughout this time he was supported by his late wife, Faye. Peter also found a great ally in Doug Sarah. Doug recently passed away and his achievements have been celebrated throughout our community. Tonight we also remember Doug Sarah and honour his significant contribution to the commemoration of Eureka. I'll now share with you a brief version of a biography about Peter Tobin written by Ron Egerberg with further additions by Paula Tobin. Peter Tobin was born in 1941. His father, Noel, had been a funeral director in Maryborough, but relocated to Ballarat to assist with the education of his children. I love that. After Peter left school, he worked for a short time with solicitors Burns, Jones and Tawney, and then joined his father in the funeral business. Peter married his wife, Faye, in 1963. They had 4 children, Marie, Paula, Bernard and Michael. When Peter's father became ill, they relocated to the funeral premises in Dawson Street South for 13 years. Peter, with his brother, also operated a service station on the corner of Dawson and Dana Streets. The funeral home eventually moved from Dawson Street to Invermay Park, and this was really the fulfilment of Peter's dream. The 7-acre Doveton Park Funeral Centre changed the way funeral homes were built in Australia. Peter was indeed a visionary leader in the funeral industry. Peter, with his brother, also rang the Shoeing Forge Service Centre on the corner of Dawson and Dana Streets. As well as being a prominent businessman in Ballarat, Peter also had a strong community-minded spirit. In 1979, Peter and Doug Sarah, together with a few others, formed the Eureka Commemorative Society to promote the significance of Eureka. The society sought to correct the historical perspective and importance of Eureka, encourage discussion and debate, and to honour the Eureka legacy. To this end, a monument was built to honour Eureka. The large flagpole at Bakery Hill Roundabout was erected to fly the Eureka flag and to mark the 125th anniversary of Eureka in 1979. Peter was also a member of the board of directors of Sovereign Hill and had held the position of president. Peter said a major highlight of his life was the privilege of assisting in the repatriation of the unknown Australian soldier from France in November 1993. The soldier had died at the end of World War I, and Peter and Rob Allison from Allison Funerals were given the responsibility of ensuring the safe passage of the soldier's body from France back to Australia. The unknown soldier was then interred in the Hall of Memory at the Australian War Memorial on Armistice Day with a slouch hat, a sprig of wattle and soil from the Pozieres battlefield. Peter's passion and commitment to Eureka and his work to ensure its respectful and important place in Ballarat's and Australia's history culminated in the staging of the 140th anniversary of the Eureka Uprising. Once concluded, he said that the society had met all its aims for the anniversary, increasing public interest, stimulating public debate, and helping to restore the miners' and soldiers' graves in the Ballarat Old Cemetery. Peter said, "Eureka must rank in the history of this country as an event that has generated more myths and facts, legends and information, passion and disinterest than any other event." Sadly, Peter died on the 29th of March 2000, aged only 59, a tragic loss to Ballarat and Eureka. His contribution to our community and the commemoration of the Eureka Stockade in particular is remembered annually through the Peter Tobin Oration. For this year's Peter Tobin Oration, we're going to hear shortly from former Wallaby and best-selling author and broadcaster, with a fabulous wife, of course, Peter FitzSimons AM. We will then hear from trailblazing historian and Stellar Prize-winning writer, Professor Clare Wright, OAM. Both Peter and Clare will share their thoughts on why Eureka matters. I hope you enjoy this year's Peter Tobin Oration. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was just sitting there listening to our Mayor looking around this building. It's been a while since I've been in here, and this is part of the legacy of the history that we're talking about tonight, and the view through some of the upper windows of the towers of the old post office building, and just the fact that we're in the mining exchange. We do have an extraordinary history. Tonight, on this 170th anniversary, we're exploring the topic of why Eureka matters. As the Mayor said, we're joined by the two most prominent and celebrated spokespeople for the significance of the Eureka Stockade, Peter FitzSimons and Professor Clare Wright. Clare and Peter will both speak individually about the topic, and after they've both spoken, I'll be inviting them to join me in a conversation about the significance of Eureka, forging some of our democratic traditions, social values as well, cultural identity, and the importance of keeping the legend of Eureka and the legacy alive, something that quite a number of people in our community have been very dedicated to do over the years that I've been lucky enough to live in Ballarat. So first up tonight, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Clare Wright. Clare Wright OAM is an award-winning historian, an author, a broadcaster, a podcaster, public commentator who's worked in politics, academia and also in the media. Claire's currently Professor of History and Professor of Public Engagement at La Trobe University. She's the author of 4 works of history, including the best-selling The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka and You Daughters of Freedom, which comprise the first 2 instalments of her Democracy trilogy. The final instalment of the trilogy, Naku Durrock, The Bark Petitions, the extraordinary story of how the people of Eureka changed the course of Australian democracy. It's a very long title. It's just been published, and there'll be more on the books later this evening. Clare hosts the ABC Radio National History series Shooting the Past and co-hosts the podcast Archive Fever. In 2020, Clare was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia for services to literature and to historical research. Will you please welcome Professor Clare Wright.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Just sitting there reflecting on the fact that when I started my book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, it was the 150th anniversary of Eureka, and I was here for that event. I actually wrote the speech for Mary Delahunty, who was at the time the Minister for Eureka. That position only lasted for that year. But I was heavily pregnant with my 3rd child at the time, and that little girl's about to turn 20, so this is how we mark time, eh? I'd like to too acknowledge that we are here on Wadawurrung land tonight and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge that these lands were stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. These lands were always a place for gathering and talking about ideas and politics and protest and diplomacy and the importance of family and tradition. This always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to say, just for starters, that this is not a debate tonight, all right? I'm not getting into any scrum with Peter over there. The reason he's got an AM and I've got an OAM is because he's that much taller than me. It's the only reason. I'd also like to acknowledge that the topic tonight is not, does Eureka matter? ? It'd be a brave soul indeed who would turn up to Ballarat on the 170th anniversary or any time, frankly, and try to argue against that proposition. I think what we're here to do tonight is to discuss why, 170 years on, people should still care about the Eureka Stockade. So, what in my mind, after spending 10 years researching this book, and it came out in 2013, and I've spent a good deal of the last 11 years talking about it too, what do I think the Eureka Stockade was? And here's my elevator pitch. The Eureka Stockade was a pivotal moment in which new colonists in Australia raised their collective voice to proclaim their right to be heard in the place that they now called home. They wanted to be consulted about the laws and policies that affected their daily lives, the lives of themselves, their families, and their community. And if this sounds familiar in the wake of the recent referendum for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, it should. More on that later. So I'm here to tell you why Eureka matters in the affirmative. But I want to start by telling you what doesn't matter about the events that took place here on this ground 170 years ago this week. What matters is not who fired the first shot. What matters is not the exact number of men and women killed at the stockade, something that we are never likely to know for an indisputable fact. But I can tell you as an indisputable fact that at least one woman was killed, something that since my research is now recognised at the Eureka Centre, fortunately. What matters not is who amputated Peter Lawler's arm, nor where it was disposed, something many descendants have and will likely continue to claim. Or whether the miners' rebellion led directly to manhood suffrage in Victoria, or whether that constitutional amendment was already in train and would have happened anyway, as certain historians argue. Or whether, and this bit has been empirically disproved, so we shouldn't still be talking about it anyway, whether the stars on the Eureka flag were made out of women's petticoats. Somewhat more controversially perhaps, what matters is not how many or which women sewed the flag, though new evidence is always turning up, and as I argue in my book, it took a team of women to sew that flag overnight. I should just say, as an aside, this little star that I'm wearing tonight, when the flag was being conserved after it was moved from the Art Gallery of Ballarat to the new Eureka Centre, which at the time was being constituted as the Museum of Australian Democracy at Eureka, the woman who did the conservation on the flag made 6 of these little stars out of the materials that she was using to conserve the flag, and she gave them to the people who were working on the establishment of MAID, of whom I was one. What matters is not even whether the Eureka Stockade, as we have come to know it, was a revolution or not. And on this score, I would be likely to shirt front Fitzy. Let me tell you what does matter about the events leading up to, during, and immediately following the armed assault on a civilian population that included women and children by the British military just before dawn on the 3rd of December 1854. Why Eureka matters is that Clara Duval Seecamp, the de facto wife of Ballarat Times editor Henry Seecamp, who was arrested on charges of sedition after the affray, that's Henry, not Clara. Clara wrote this in her editorial on the 1st of January 1855. Who are the foreigners? Where are the foreigners? What is it that constitutes a foreigner? Poor Governor Hotham, could you not have found some other more truthful excuse for all the illegal and even murderous excesses committed by your soldiery and butchers? Why did you disregard our memorials and entreaties, our prayers and our cries for justice and protection against your unjust stewards here, until the people, sickened by hope deferred, and maddened by continued and increased acts of oppression, were driven to take up arms in self-defence? What is this country else but Australia? Clara Seecamp asked. Is it any more England than it is Ireland or Scotland, France or America, Italy or Germany? No, the population of Australia is not English, but Australian. The latest immigrant is the youngest Australian. What matters is that in 1854, the first female newspaper editor in this country, which is what Clara Seecamp was, denounced xenophobia and scapegoating to declare Australia's cultish independence and give voice to the voiceless, those who had been sickened by hope deferred. Why Eureka matters is that Ellen Young, the self-proclaimed Ballarat poetess, wrote to Governor Hotham months before the conflagration at Eureka to propose an alternative, fairer taxation system that would appease the diggers' disgust at what amounted to an unjust poll tax on their presence, not their income. It could be said that Ellen's advocacy of a fairer tax system for the people kicked off a great Australian tradition. The Albanese government's changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts to make them better and fairer for 85% of Australians only came about after intense lobbying from organisations such as the Australia Institute. Then, following the monster meeting on Bakery Hill on the 11th of November, it was Ellen Young who represented the voice of the people. She wrote this and published it in the Ballarat Times. However we may lament great misdeeds in high places, justice must be awarded to the universal demand of an indignant people. The diseased limbs of the law must be lopped off, or mortification will ensue the whole body. Thus I would speak to our governor, "Oh, Sir Charles, we had better hopes of you. We, the people, demand cheap land, just magistrates, to be represented in the Legislative Council, in fact treated as the free subjects of a great nation. Not request, not humbly pray, demand. Not petitioners, but people. We, the people, that great shorthand for democratic liberty." Why Eureka Matters is that men and women demanded the right to be counted, the right to be heard. Why Eureka Matters is that a jury would not convict a random rabble of dissidents, not even the black man, John Joseph, of the overblown charge of sedition for proclaiming that right to be heard. Why Eureka Matters is not so much that it was the birth of Australian democracy, a birthing story, an origin story, I might note, that right up until the 160th anniversary of Eureka was considered to be populated exclusively by men, as if it was women who were not allowed in the labour ward. But what matters is what happened to that political baby after they took their first steps. The developmental milestones, the stepping stones to where we are now. This is that book, Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. This is the third book in the trilogy that, as mentioned, was just published, Naku Darok, The Bark Petitions. And I want to tell you a little bit about this, and then you'll see how it relates to what I've just been talking about. The Bark Petitions, or Naku Darok, in the Yolngu language of the Yirrkala people, the Yolngu people of northeast Arnhem Land, were the first petitions to be put to the federal parliament in an Australian language. They were also the first petitions presented to the federal parliament that led directly to a parliamentary inquiry. They were the first petitions by Indigenous Australians to assert land rights, and as such are the direct precursor to subsequent land rights legislation, as well as the paradigm-shifting native title rulings in Mabo. These factors alone make the petitions important documents in the history of our nation. But more than just setting those procedural precedents, Naku Darok, the Bark Petitions, can be seen as an attempt by the Yolngu people to come to a form of diplomatic agreement making between one sovereign nation and another. In 1963, when the Bark Petitions were put to the Australian Parliament, the Yolngu people believed themselves to be nothing but the owners of their land, acting under their own governance structures, economic autonomy, and legal regimes. In other words, as I just said, almost as a matter of formality at the beginning, but I meant very deeply, their sovereignty had never been ceded. Widening the frame, we can also see Naku Darok, the Bark Petitions, as a pivotal event in the history of Australian democracy, sitting alongside the Eureka Rebellion, 1854, workers' rights, Eureka Flag, and the women's suffrage movement, 1902, women's rights, women's suffrage, proclaimed through the women's suffrage banner. That's why Naku Darok is the third book of my democracy trilogy. The trilogy turns on the material heritage of Australian democracy: flag, banner, bark. But each one also demonstrates that each of these historical moments, 1854, 1902, around Federation, 1963, was about disenfranchised people demanding the right to be heard and to be counted. Each of these movements, these moments, was about voice. The Bark Petitions, I'd argue, constitute nothing less than the third pillar of a trinity of material objects that, if we read them together, along this historical, political and cultural continuum, constitutes Australia's founding documents. As the United States has its Constitution, Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence, all housed together in that purpose-built national facility that attracts millions of patriotic pilgrims a year, so too Australia has a suite of nation-defining archival artefacts. So first, the Eureka flag, symbol of the struggle for rights and liberties waged by a disenfranchised cohort of newcomers to Gold Rush Victoria, men and women who fought to have the voice of unpropertied people heard in the making of laws that govern their lives, including the right to representation for their taxation. In 1854, the women of Eureka sewed a flag that represented the collective identity and aspirations of those people, the polyglot miners and merchants who rallied beneath it. As Clara Seacamp so passionately and provocatively asserted in her editorial. The Eureka Stockade is known to the history books, as I said, as the birthplace of Australian democracy. It's still taught to school children that way today. A democracy that meant, in its essence, government for the people, by the people. Now, women worked towards that lofty enterprise, but were denied the political spoils of their labour. Universal suffrage, manhood suffrage, was enacted in Victoria, a legislative feat that made it the most politically progressive British jurisdiction in the world. Women who had fought and died at Eureka were thrown under the bus. So second, we get to the women's suffrage banner, which hangs in Parliament House today. With the next big nation-building development, federation, women were once again at the vanguard of that movement for change. And this time, it must be constitutionally enshrined change. This time, women saw the bus coming. In 1897, South Australian women who already had the vote lobbied their elected representatives at the Constitutional Convention in Adelaide to fight for their electoral rights. They were successful and effectively made universal womanhood suffrage a precondition of a federated Australia. When the Franchise Act was passed in 1902, Australian women became the most fully enfranchised in the world. Their civic voices heard and their voices counted. Australian women trumpeted their victory and heralded their peerless political equality on the world stage with their magnificent banner, the Women's Suffrage Banner, painted by Dora Meeson Coates. The banner was paraded before hundreds of thousands of people in London's mass suffragette rallies in 1908 and 1911, easy to comprehend as it said what the world already knew. Australia was the most democratic country on earth, its women the most fully enfranchised. White women, that is. Aboriginal women were thrown under the bus. The Franchise Act of 1902, the very same act that enshrined unprecedented political rights for women, prohibited all Indigenous Australians from voting in federal elections. The Immigration Restriction Act that was passed by that inaugural parliament similarly ensured that the latest immigrant was the youngest Australian only if she or he was European and white. And third, the Yirrkala Bark petitions, Naku Daruk. It would take another 60 years for the Yolngu people of northeast Arnhem Land to throw the bus out with the democratic bathwater, as it were. The story of that remarkable feat of colonial literacy and of diplomatic ingenuity is told in this latest book. So each of these declamatory objects speaks back to power, a creative act of resistance to a perceived political injustice. Each makes a claim for inclusion in the dominant power structures, first of the colonies, here in Ballarat, then of the nation, and each represents a change in people's relationship to the state. In a democracy, the state requires people's consent to govern them. The state cannot have all its own way. The state is required to give up some of its absolute power, including the power to make decisions on behalf of disenfranchised or otherwise legally dispossessed people. The state can no longer use methods of coercive control. It has to negotiate, consult, compensate, and bargain. Political philosopher John Stuart Mills argued that a democratic society is one where the people know that, and this is his quote, everyone is degraded when other people, without consulting him, take upon themselves unlimited power to regulate his destiny. And armed with that knowledge, they build institutions that safeguard against such unlimited power. If this is so, then these three objects can be said to constitute the material heritage of Australian democracy. Each is a symbol of that demand for consultation, the fight to regulate one's political destiny, a tangible relic of the right to be heard. And all three were conceived and crafted not by statesmen or lawyers with quill and ink, you've all seen Hamilton, but handmade by men and women on the ground, struggling for rights and recognition, dignity and decency, demanding their voices be heard and their sovereign bodies counted, holding lawmakers accountable to the notion that government by the people and for the people should mean all the people. There's a fourth material item that may, in time, transform a trinity of founding documents into a quartet. In May 2017, after a long period of community consultation and consensus-driven decision-making, the First Nations National Constitutional Convention met at Uluru in Australia's Red Centre. Together, the majority of the 250 delegates drafted a momentous statement, variously described as an invitation and a petition, not to the Australian government, but to the Australian people. Standing at the base of the natural monolith which gave the declaration its name, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, Professor Megan Davis, co-chair of the dialogue process, publicly read the collective affirmation for the first time. And I'm going to read you a couple of passages from the Uluru Statement now. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at an unprecedented rate. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. As we know, in October 2023, a referendum was held to change the Australian Constitution to enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament. We know what happened. The Voice referendum was soundly defeated. 169 years after Eureka, Australia, it seems, was not yet ready to extend to its First Peoples what Clara Seacamp had asked for its gold rush immigrants. That our memorials and entreaties, our prayers and our cries for justice and protection against your unjust stewards here be duly regarded, so that the Indigenous people of this country, sickened by hope deferred, remember that, the torment of our powerlessness, sickened by hope deferred, and maddened by continued and increased acts of oppression, could have their voices peacefully heard. The Eureka story has been used as a political football since at least the late 19th century, a symbol of resistance to tyranny and injustice that is still utilised by both progressive and conservative forces. The mining industry loves to evoke Eureka as a touchstone of the need to resist oppressive taxation laws by government. And unions still proudly fly the Eureka flag as an emblem of workers' rights and entitlements. So, if Eureka matters, how do we keep alive its legend and legacy, especially for future generations? I think the most enduring legacy to come out of Eureka is the fact that the polyglot, heterosocial, cross-cultural, multiracial community of Ballarat raised its voice as one, calling for a voice in the making of the laws that affected people's daily lives. This call for a representative voice is fundamental to democracy. If the voice referendum is any indication, the story of Eureka is not over, because the fight for justice continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for your speech this evening. Peter FitzSimons, AM, is Australia's best-selling non-fiction writer. For the last 35 years, he's been a journalist and columnist with the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun Herald. He's the author of highly successful books, including Eureka, The Unfinished Revolution, Breaker Morant, Burke and Wills, Monash's Masterpiece, Kokoda, Ned Kelly, and Gallipoli, as well as biographies of notable Australians such as Sir Douglas Mawson, Nancy Wake and Nick Farr-Jones. He's been busy. His passion is to tell Australian stories, so our own stories, of great men and women and stirring events across our history. His latest book is The Legend of Albert Jacka, and it brings to life the memory and legacy of Albert Jacka, a shy young lad from country Victoria, whose efforts at Gallipoli saw him awarded the first Victoria Cross Medal in World War I. Please welcome Peter FitzSimons.
So, thank you, Stephen, and thank you all. I think you're all going to have mercy on me. I am following a professor to the podium. I am one whose long-time proud boast is that sixth class was the 4 most difficult years of my life. I don't think I know any of you personally, unless my erstwhile biographical subject, Nini King, is in the house. I still feel curiously like I'm among my own people. I think the fact that I'm accompanied by my wife, Lisa. Many of my more cruel mates say the fact that I'm married to Lisa makes me the president of the Australian men punching well above their weight club. And I'm delighted to see so many of my fellow members here tonight. It is really seriously a great honour to speak here on the 170th anniversary in this hall for this occasion with that wonderful flag behind me. And thank you so much for turning up in such numbers. When I report on this in the Sydney Morning Herald, I will say it was fantastic to speak to 2,000 people in Ballarat. But I tell you what, 312 is wonderful. Allow me to take a Dennis Lilly run-up, if I may, to my theme that Eureka Matters, because our nation is in desperate need of a new, or at least renewed, unifying national foundation story. Look, I am, you are, we are Australian, and from all the lands on earth we come, and for the most part, as a people, I think we are proud to be Australian. I know I am. It's not easy, however, to define Australianness. I love the line from an English law lord in 1796 where he said, "I don't know how to define obscenity, but I know it when I see it." I feel the same about Australianness, and Stephen has mentioned all the books with an Australian theme that I write, and again, I still can't define it, but I know it when I see it, and I feel at my best when I'm writing about it, and I never vibrated so pleasingly as when I was writing about the Eureka. But the truth of it is, of all the nations on earth, we have more division as a people on matters of nationhood than of just about any other nation on earth, with the likely exception of America right now. But don't get me started. Over who are we? What are we? What are our values? What is the guts of us? Half of us, and I, by God, am one, can barely believe that as late as the 3rd decade of the 21st century, we are still in Australia reduced to finding our head of state, our Australian head of state, from a family of pommy aristocrats living in a palace in London. Do you know, it's just... Our leaders, our elected Australian democratic leaders, before they get remotely close to the levers of power, have to say, dib, 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 dob, 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 I swear my fealty to a man living in London who has a shiny hat and long robes and is there purely by birthright. Could there be anything more un-Australian, more ludicrous than that? Half of us, and I am one, can barely believe that as late as the third decade of the 21st century right now, we still have the flag of another nation on our flag. Cue Jerry Seinfeld when he came out to Australia in the year 2000. I love your flag. Great Britain at night. That's what we look like to the world. Half of us, and I am one, think that we can do better for a unifying national day than to commemorate the day an open-air prison was established on the east coast of Australia by the white fellas hauling up the Union Jack and going dib, 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 dob, dob, dob. We hereby dispossess you black fellas of your land, and if you don't like it, we'll show you the noisy end of a gun. Seriously, can we not do better? And I've got a very smart audience. I reckon I'm carrying about 90% of you with me at this moment. But in wider Australia, it's about 50-50. These stories, whether you agree with my point or you don't agree, we can all agree that as a people, we're divided on these stories. A part of the problem for all of the above has been the lack of the unifying story, a creation story, if you will, to quicken our pulse, stiffen our sinews, say, yeah, that's us, that's who we are. And I love the Gallipoli story myself. I've written a book on it, but there are problems with it. For one thing, we were invading a foreign land in fealty to what was still seen as Mother England, pursuing a harebrained idea by an Englishman who'll remain nameless. Let's just call him Winston Churchill. And I say that with deep respect for those who fought at Gallipoli, and indeed I rage that so many of our young Australians died there for that purpose on that, for that terrible 8 months. 8,500 of them were left behind. Another problem with the Gallipoli story is in terms of inclusivity, a story that all of the population can identify with. The central part of that story is magnificent. It's the storming of the cliffs and the holding on for 8 months thereafter. And as magnificent as the nurses were in the hospital ships, most of the story is missing agenda. There's agenda missing. It's a story we tell over and over and over, and it's all about what the men did. When it comes to military ventures, I would also say, for what it's worth, Villers-Bretonneux, Tobruk and Kokoda, they were extraordinary stories. And in recognition of this, others have tried to vaunt other national stories. People have tried to get When Captain Cook Landed as a great story. I am generally an admirer of Captain Cook. You know, by the standards of the time, he was kinder and gentler than most of the maritime captains of that time. However, I can't ignore the fact that before he set foot on Australian soil, he took a blunderbuss, he put it with birdshot, he lined up the brave Indigenous warrior on the left, and he pulled the trigger. And we don't talk about that. When that was first brought to me by my researchers, I said, well, that can't be true. That can't possibly be true. How could this iconic moment not be known by most of us that Captain Cook, 2 Indigenous warriors blocking the way, so he shouted, get out of the way, he got the blunderbuss, went between them, they didn't move, so he lined up the brave warrior on the left, he pulled the trigger. It's not a sort of, for us, yeah, what a great, great moment was that. When Captain Phillip landed, which is commemorated, of course, in at least the raising of the flag for Australia Day, again, I go back to what I said. It was the establishment of an open-air prison, and a story that would break your heart. That was in January 1788. In June, a sailor wrote home, and he talked about the Indigenous folk, and he said, we call them the Warrawarras. Why do we say Warra Warra? Why do we call them Warra Warra? Because Warra Warra in the Indigenous language of that people was go away, leave us alone. And they said it so often, even as they receded further and further into the bush, that they became known as the Warrawarras. Again, my fellow Australians, can we really say, what about that? How good was that? Of 100 Australians of all stripes, all races, all genders, how many of us can really be proud of that? It happened, it's a part of our history, we should know about it, but for a unifying national story, no. Others say lately, because we go through this wretched thing of the discussion of Australia Day every year, it seems to get earlier and earlier. Other people say, why don't we go for the story of federation? For me, okay, 1901, 1st of January, it's really hard to say, okay, kids, get around. I'll tell you the story of federation. And when we get to the climactic moment, and the Governor-General reached into his pocket, he took out a pen, and he signed the bastard. What about that? It's not really sort of your beauty. For me, our national story, the one that can quicken the pulse, stiffen the sinew, the one that should, of course, be our national story is the one, the only, the magnificent saga of the Eureka Stockade, which climaxed 170 years ago today. It solves all of the issues of the above. It is republican in nature, it gives us a flag to be proud of, and it'll give us a wonderful national day. But most important of all, as a yarn, it has everything, starting with being, it's a cracker story. It's a one you will delight in telling your children, and they'll delight in telling their children. And the importance of such yarns, being great, cannot be overstated. When I became chair of the Australian Republic movement in 2015, one of the key interactions I had earlier was with Professor John Maloney, the founder of Eureka's Children. He wrote to me, he said, politicians do not create the nation. The storytellers, the makers of ballads and the singers, the poets and the painters, the cartoonists and the actors, they create the nation. Gather them in. They will all be on side and they will win over the people. Again, for me, Eureka is the story to inspire all of the above. It's a story that has everything. I've always loved the American national anthem. I love that part. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. I love the Flower of Scotland that they sing in the rugby particularly. Oh, Flower of Scotland, when will we see your light again, your likes again, that fought and died for your wee bit hill and glen and stood against him. Proud Edward's army and sent him homewards to sing again, to think again. I shouldn't sing, I can see my wife saying, please stop singing. La Marseillaise, marchons, marchons, que le sang impur, abreuve nos sillons. The Eureka Stockade, all of the magnificence of those anthems, they're all contained in the saga of the Eureka Stockade. And it's far more than what Bob Carr once called, quite dismissively, a local tax revolt. In one story, you have all these magnificent things, the very foundation stones of what it is to be in Australia, from multiculturalism to mateship, from our broad distrust of the elites who'd seek to rule us, to our wide embrace of egalitarianism and our insistence on a fair go mate, to the very use of the word mate. In the willingness of the diggers to roll up their sleeves and just get on with it, whatever the appalling conditions, and their propensity to pull together to overcome hardships, I recognise much of the spirit that the country was built on. In their refusal to cower before power, most particularly their loud insistence to the government of no taxation without representation, and backing that up with their willingness to fight for their rights, even against overwhelming odds, it's every bit as good as the Boston Tea Party and better. And those rights that they were fighting for, as Clare said, the birth of Australian democracy, and I would put it higher, it was the light, to use Chifley's choice phrase, what happened at the Eureka was the light on the hill for liberal democracy around the world. The intellectual spine of the whole Eureka Stockade were the Chartists in England, many of whom refugees were on the minefields here, and they had 6 demands: a vote for every man over the age of 21, secret ballots, no property qualification before you could vote. They wanted parliamentarians to be paid so it wouldn't just be rich people who were in the parliaments, constituencies of equal size. And so there was a thrust for democracy that Eureka was testing. You will know, as Ballaratians, if that's the phrase that I'm looking for, probably better than me, the ins and outs of the story, but you had the system of the squatters from the 1830s on, coming up from Port Phillip Bay, planting their flag, building their homesteads. You couldn't be within 3 miles of another homestead, so you had thousands of acres. For that, you had to pay only £10 a year. Here on the minefields in Ballarat, it was 8 foot by 8 foot, and you had to pay 30 shillings a month, win, lose or draw. It was outrageous. The squatters could go into the parliaments. The poor bastards here could do nothing like that. They were struggling to hold on unless they found nuggets. And here at Bakery Hill, and sadly it kills me with the greatest respect, Bakery Hill, this iconic sacred site in Australia, now instead of the Eureka flag, you've got the golden arches. Please, Madam Mayor, it's time. So this great thing, there's been the rumbling, there's been the fight against the licence. They have the monster meeting, the second one, on the afternoon, Thursday the 30th of November, 1854. And the theme of it was basically, we're not going to take it anymore. Peter Lalor, and again, a very Australian story, not out of central casting, just a person who arose up to the moment. He climbs up onto the stump before the 10,000 throng of men and women. As Professor Clare makes the point, 1/3 of them women. And he says these wonderful words: I looked around me. I saw brave and honest men. And again, Clare has made the point in the history writing of the time, the women were more or less left out, but she has done more than anybody to rectify that, who had come thousands of miles to labour for independence. I knew that hundreds were in great poverty who would possess wealth and happiness if allowed to cultivate the wilderness that surrounded us. The grievances under which we had long suffered and the brutal attack of the day flashed across my mind, and with the burning feelings of an injured man, I mounted the stump and I proclaimed liberty. The great chronicler of those times, Raffaello Carboni, recorded the wondrous looks of the people at this moment, the earnestness of so many faces of all kinds of shape and colour, the motley heads of all sorts of size and hair, the shagginess of so many beards of all lengths and thicknesses, the vividness of double the number of eyes, electrified by the magnetism of the Southern Cross, was one of those grand sights such as are recorded only in the history of the Crusaders in Palestine. He noted these wonderful words: we were of all nations and colours, irrespective of nationality, religion or colour, to salute the Southern Cross as a refuge of all the oppressed from all the countries on earth. There could be nothing more multicultural, nothing more magnificent, nothing more Australian than that. So Lalor has got the 10,000, all genders, all shapes, all sizes, all religions, all nascent Australians basically. He says to them, it's my duty to swear you in and to take with you the oath to be faithful to the Southern Cross. Hear me with attention. He climbs up and he has them repeat after him. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. They all repeated it. It was done for the first time since the colonisation of this land began 7 decades earlier. The fealty of a large body of people had been sworn to an entity other than the British Crown. Instead, they had sworn loyalty to each other, to their rights and liberties. Nothing could be more magnificent, more Australian than that. He called for an armed insurrection. That night, and I love this story, that night they need men, they need fighters, they need diggers. Where are they going to get them? They get them from Creswick. I think, Creswick, I know. 18 miles from here, and it's the great untold story. You've got this guy, a Scotsman, Thomas Kennedy, and he says to the 2,000 of them gathered at Creswick, we basically send lawyers, guns and money, more or less, but he says moral persuasion is all humbug. Nothing convinces like a lick in the lug. We need you now. And every brilliant story has to have, in any one of my books you'll find it, it has to have, I insist, a dark and stormy night. Has to have it. Burke and Wills, I struggled as they were going through the middle of Australia to find a dark and stormy night, but sure enough, I found one. And I put it in there. This Thursday night, before that Sunday, the wind howled, the rain came down, thunder, lightning, and 2,000 of them marched along the bush track between Creswick and Ballarat behind a German Oompa band singing La Marseillaise. It doesn't get any more Australian than that. The Americans have, if you've been to the Smithsonian Institution, you see on their Declaration of Independence in beautiful, wonderful copper plate writing, in the most intricate, poetic, romantic, beautiful phraseology is written, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, have the right to pursue their independence." On the Friday, we had a Declaration of Independence too. It was not quite as well phrased as that, and it wasn't on beautiful parchment, and it wasn't in copper plate writing. It was scrawled in pencil on a bit of butcher's paper on the back of it, and somebody who read it said, "I rather have the impression that the tyrants got a very bad time of it." But we had our Declaration of Independence. That Friday and that Saturday they drilled, they prepared. As we know, the redcoats came in the early hours of the Sunday morning, and there weren't 2,000 there were about 150. It was a Saturday night after all, so many of the men were elsewhere. The battle broke out, a couple of the dozen were killed. Peter Lalor, as Claire mentioned, lost his arm. I declare him in my book to be Australia's first one-armed bandit as he tried to get away. 13 of them were put on trial for their lives for treason. They were all acquitted, which was a victory for Australian justice. So firstly and most obviously, the whole thing is a great story of democracy, of a group of brave people fighting for and winning their democratic rights. All put together, I entirely concur with the words written by the current parliamentarian, Andrew Leigh, with 3 others. They did a book, Imagining Australia, Ideas for Our Future. And they penned this for the 150th anniversary, but I think it's never more apposite than right now, where they said it's time to reclaim this legend as our driving force. Australia, they wrote, should re-elevate Eureka to its previous position as a central legend of Australian nationalism, standing for those distinctly Australian values: egalitarianism, mateship, fairness, together with democracy, freedom, republicanism and multiculturalism. Obviously, Australian nationalism can never be reduced to just one legend, but Eureka offers great potential to a nation floundering for a national story. And their idea that I love most of all, our rather limp citizenship oath, could be revitalised with a fragment of the bold Eureka oath. How wonderful if new citizens could swear this: "We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and to defend our rights and our liberties." How wonderful. And how wonderful if, when we do become a republic, what better flag to choose than the Eureka flag? They were good people fighting for a great cause, laying the very foundation stones on which modern Australia has been built. I salute them, I salute their flag. I am, you are, we are Australian, and Eureka is our story. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We are now going to have a conversation on stage and to flesh out a couple of the ideas. The good folk at the Eureka Centre did give me some questions to ask. I think I'm going to throw most of them out and just go with what's been said this evening, and a couple of observations that I have made just about tonight and who's here tonight. I'll get to that one in just a moment. But given what's just been said by our two guest speakers, I just want to go back one small step with both Clare and Peter to just hear from you, Clare, initially. What got you started with the Eureka story? At what point in your life did this suddenly a light go on for you and want to actually start telling stories around Eureka?
Are you coming to sit back down with us? Okay. Good, because then I can sit this way and not do that. It's a great question, and now you also know why I didn't want to debate Peter. And he's put the mayor on notice. Imagine what he would have done to me. I first became interested in Eureka when I was writing my PhD about 1,000 billion years ago, which was a history of female publicans in Australia. And that became my first book, Beyond the Ladies' Lounge. And one of the things that I realised in writing that book was that so many of the pivotal events in Australian history had featured women because so many of those events had happened in pubs and so many of the pubs were run by women. So this sort of weird circularity and like, you know, many of the characters that Peter have written about, I'm thinking Ned Kelly, you know, Ned Kelly's last stand at the Glenrowan Inn, that pub was run by Anne Jones. Much less is known about her. I've written about her in other contexts, that she went to jail as well. She wasn't, so maybe that's why we haven't written her story. But one of the women that I came across, or a reference that I came across in that work, was of Catherine Bentley, who had run the Eureka Hotel that was famously burnt down in the lead up to Eureka. So I found this reference to Mrs. Bentley, who was also tried for the murder of Scobie on the event during the event that led up to the torching of the pub. And I didn't have the time or the resources at that point to go into her story, but I kind of put a bookmark in it, and I thought, goodness, if there was a Mrs. Bentley at Eureka, how many other women might have been there? Because that flies in the face of everything I've been taught about Eureka. So when I was a school kid growing up in the 1970s, you know, and role play was the way that we were trying to get children interested in history. Now it's TikTok. But role play, you know, you got up in front of the class and there were the miners and there were the military, and you could choose which side you wanted to be on, and you were smart if you chose to be a miner because more of you got to fall down dead than the military did. But you couldn't choose whether to be a man or a woman. There was only one role you could play. There's only one gender of that role. And so I wanted to test that theory. There was this Mrs. Bentley. There was this myth that the stars on the flag were sewn from the petticoats of women. Well, which women? You couldn't find it in the history books. I went sort of searching in the secondary material, John Maloney and Geoffrey Blaney and others, and so when I applied for my postdoctoral research fellowship, which was sort of the next thing after my PhD, that's the topic that I applied for. Setting out on this with a simple question: were there women at Eureka? If so, what were they doing? What were they doing there? And that set me off on this 10 years of research, not because it was a needle in a haystack exercise, because the archive, which is what I worked from, I threw out all the secondary reading, the archive just revealed so much.
Peter, for you,
can I ask her a question as well?
Her?
Gee,
Me?
I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Professor
right.
Can I
Wright.
ask
Just
you?
one.
Well,
Yeah,
he's
just one.
moderating. I'm interested to go back one further. When did you've mentioned you did the book on women publicans. Were you like 12 years old with Platts when you were reading history, and you realised all of the history I'm reading is about men? Did you have a seminal moment where you realised history is leaving out my gender?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And no, it didn't happen in high school. I was a complete history nerd in high school. And it never occurred to me to ask the question, where am I in this story at that point? I pretty much went through my whole undergraduate years at university as well, without asking that question. It's actually really hard to ask questions that go against the grain, and particularly questions that go against the grain of national ethos, national mythologies. It's like questioning the church. And people are doing that a lot more now. But, you know, this is before the Berlin Wall fell, and we still believed in the ideologies and the big picture narratives that we were told, and the idea that women did shit was just not something that actually really ever occurred to me.
Peter, can I just ask you to briefly explain your moment where you wanted to tell the Eureka story?
I think at the Mangrove Mountain Community Fair in 1966, Mum dressed me as a digger. You know, like we were told about the Eureka Stockade, and it seemed to me romantic. You know, it seemed to be a great event, and we built a stockade next to the little church house, and I think I was defending against other boys from Mangrove Mountain who were in red coats.
You just made up that place, didn't you?
Mangrove Mountain, you look it up. That's
so over time, that fascination from your childhood has grown.
I would say that growing up at Peats Ridge, which is just south of Mangrove Mountain, Mum and Dad had returned from the Second World War. They had 7 children. Each of them I was the youngest. We got bigger as we got younger. Mum said I was so long when I was born. She said, Pete, you were born on the 27th, the 28th and the 29th of June, 1961. And it was a very Australian upbringing because in the tomato packing shed, Dad would teach us poetry as we just packed tomatoes all night long. And for some reason, that got into my soul. So, when you get to the most wonderful poem of all, and when they reached the mountain summit, even Clancy took a pull, for it well might make the boldest hold their breath, for the hidden ground was full of wombat holes, and any slip meant death. But the man from Snowy River let the pony have his head, and he swung his stock whip round and gave a cheer, and he raced it down the mountain like a torrent down its bed, while the others stood and watched in very fear. And at 5 or 6, I couldn't breathe when Dad would recite that. And I think for me, somehow, when I said you can't define Australianness, I guess the stories that I love most is that where everybody else is hesitating, and you go, cop this. And I like that in football too.
I do ask that question about your point of contact with Eureka for a very specific reason. Just very briefly, mine, I reckon, was about 1981, 82. There's a family photo of me on a beach somewhere with my mother and sister wearing a Eureka Stockade t-shirt. And I remember wearing that and loving that t-shirt. And I grew up in Sydney. And I remember also being abused walking down the streets of Sydney because people saw it as a BLF t-shirt at the time. So that was my early thing. So the reason I want to know about your early days is because I've looked at the audience. And I don't want to be rude, but we're older. There's one school-age audience member sitting down there who I'm pretty sure I know, who is, no, not you, sir, I'm afraid, but so my question to you two is, if the people who are coming out for this on the 170th are all my age or a little older, just a little, how do we get young people engaged in the story again? I'll let Peter go first on this one.
I've got a very quick answer. Netflix. You get, and Claire's written a manuscript, a script for one co-American production, I believe, quite seriously. That is the way to get the story we've been telling, and it's got to go on screen, and it's got to have, fabulous characters, be true to life, and let the magnificence of the story play out.
Claire?
Yeah, so the two points. Yes, Peter's absolutely right, and this is where stories are mostly told now. So I think Peter's point that we need to have stories that people want to listen to, that are relevant, that speak to something quite essential, but also real and authentic. I think people aren't going to buy the same kind of stories that just leave so many people out of the question anymore, so many people out of the picture. I agree with your point that one of the things that's magnificent about Eureka is that you don't have to create diversity and inclusion. It's there, it's part of the essential narrative. You don't have to invent international audiences and characters, and this is exactly what I found. I was telling Peter before, my book is being developed into a 10-part television drama series with an American co-production company. And we have a pilot script that was written by one of the women who worked on the first 3 seasons of Outlander, for any Outlander fans in the room. And, you know, part of the pitch was that this Forgotten Rebels will do for Victoria what Outlander did for Scotland, which was increase tourism by about 1 bazillion% because everybody wanted to go out and see Culloden suddenly. But the reason why, what's been so fun for me in developing the story is that it's fiction, but you don't have to make very much up. Like now, I have, as a historian, I couldn't write about things, and this is written in a very novelistic and a very filmic, cinematic way, but I couldn't put two people in the room if I didn't have a piece of evidence that suggested they were there. But on the screen, you suddenly can start to make, you have to make protagonists and antagonists. You have to have people who want something and then characters who want to stop them from getting that thing. It's all there in the story, but now you can also make people have a lot of sex.
Do you, may I ask one more question?
Okay, a second one.
Do you agree that it was the light on the hill for liberal democracy globally?
No.
Next
Why
question.
not?
I also don't believe, as I suggested, that it was an unfinished revolution. If it was a revolution at all, it was a sociological revolution. I don't believe that Eureka was about egalitarianism. People didn't want to be the same as everybody else. People wanted to better their position that they had come from. People didn't want to not be part of the British Empire, and the vast majority of them. They wanted to be included. They wanted to have the same British rights and liberties as other people did. They weren't trying to overthrow the government. They were trying to be included in the government. The Republican strand of it was very minor. The egalitarian, the rights and liberties, absolutely, but it was British rights and liberties that they were fighting for, and for people who were disenfranchised to be included in that. And so the sociological revolution was the topsy-turviness of the goldfields, is that you could be you could come to Victoria as a washerwoman, and you could make a lot of coin quickly because there were a lot of blokes who needed their washing done. And then with the money that you earned, you could buy a pub, and then you could quickly rise through the ranks of society. Social aspiration was absolutely integral to what people wanted out of Eureka. They just didn't want the structural inequalities that meant that they couldn't get there.
I respectfully submit that when they're firing on the redcoats marching up the hill, they're not on the side of the government that sent them. Thank you.
From that point, the other thing that I would like to explore with you guys, and it goes back to that reference of mine about the T-shirt, the BLF, and the way the Eureka symbol is now used often by fringe groups. We've seen the rise of some fringe groups. So I just wonder how we as a nation reclaim this and bring it back into the centre rather from the fringes of both the left and the right, to make it something that people want to engage with more, because Peter, you were saying we are 50-50 on a lot of things, so how do we get this well over that 50-50 line?
I would love to see the Eureka flag either, this may not be popular, but in Canberra, or, you know, in a truck moving around the country to take it, to tell the story. But I love it, you know, Ballarat's its spiritual home, and I guess it should be like the ashes, I guess, go home to Lords.
It's very fragile.
It's very fragile, but it's so precious. I mean, for me, the three most precious artefacts in the country, well, one of them's not in the country, I think Ned Kelly's helmet, the Eureka flag, and the Gweagle shield, which is in exhibition number 198 in the British Museum, speaking of stuff the British stole. And when I came here, I think it was 2013, to open the Museum of Democracy, the other speaker was your Premier, Dennis Napthine. And I sort of babbled and I said, Mr. Napthine, Premier Napthine, look, Don Burke back in 1979 was able to put the Ned Kelly helmet on, and I've written to the State Library of Victoria and they won't let me do it. Would that be all right? And he went like that, and a young man came and he said, Mr. FitzSimons would like to wear the helmet, Ned Kelly helmet. Please arrange that with State Library of Victoria. Monday morning, I wrote and said, State Library of Victoria Director, I talked to Premier Napthine on Saturday, and he said that it would be arranged that I could wear the Ned Kelly helmet for the book that I'm doing. And they wrote back about 10 minutes later and said, Dear Mr. FitzSimons, we could not give a flying uck what Premier Napthine said. If you get within 50 metres of Ned Kelly's helmet, we'll shoot you ourselves.
Claire, reclaiming the flag. How do we do that? How do we get it back into the centre?
I think it's a really hard ask, in the same way that I don't think Ned Kelly's armour can be central to our storytelling, because there's always going to be so much controversy about whether he was defending his family or a cop killer. And there will be historians and there will be lay people who will be arguing that toss till the sun goes down. And I think that the politicisation of Eureka can be its weakness, but as Peter suggested, can also be its strength if we are able to see it as a unifying factor. I think the problem is not so much about the flag itself, but I think it's the nature of party politics at the moment. And we've just seen last year something that could have been a unifying moment in Australian history, the voice referendum, and we saw what the political parties did with that. And it became so deeply politicised and so divisive so quickly that, and used for those political purposes that were really very short term and very opportunistic. So I think that the difficulty is not in the history, it's not in the artefact, it's not where the artefact resides, it's in the fact that politics is so deeply divisive in itself that it's very difficult to have a political emblem that is going to be seen as being acceptable to any kind of centre when there really isn't much of a centre anymore.
Peter, you look like you want to say something.
I'm looking for the next question.
Okay, all right. Just given the timelines that we have been given, I have been asked to ask you two about your next books for conclusion, because there will be book signing down the back, and if people would like to ask a question of you two, they can line up and do that during the book signing.
I don't want to hijack this occasion and ask you to beg you even to read my books. I honestly, hand on my heart, hope to die, do not care if you do or don't read my books. Don't care. All I care is that you buy my books.
All right. Tell them about your book on
My
Albert
latest
Jacka.
book is The Legend of Albert Jacka VC. When I was on 3AW about 3 years ago, your man Neil Mitchell said they should make me an honorary Victorian because I write about so many Victorians. But Albert Jacka VC, what an extraordinary Australian. A woodcutter from Wedderburn, more anonymous than a lost dog when he left Australia. He came back as the most revered Australian in the land. 200,000 Melburnians turned out to greet him. He was quietly spoken. He was extraordinary in a fight. If you can imagine the horror of here we are, we 300 here, and we're approaching the Western Front for the first time with Albert Jacka. It's getting dark, there's a rumbling coming towards us. What's that rumbling? Is it thunder? No, that's the artillery landing on the trenches we're approaching. It gets dark, there's a pulsing light. What's that? Oh God, it's the shells exploding that we're going into. The ground beneath our feet gets spongy. Why is it spongy? Because we're treading on the dead bodies of the men that died 3 months ago, 3 weeks ago, 3 days ago, 3 hours ago. We get into the trench with Jacka, and through the night the shells come down. There's 30 of us to start. In the morning there's 7 of us left. Jacka sees 50 Germans have broken through. He says to the 7 of us, fix bayonets, we're going to charge. And Jacka VC was the only one they'd follow like that, and they did. They won the battle. Jacka had 7 wounds at the end of that. For that, being called that the most audacious and dramatic individual act of the First World War. That was not what he got the VC for. He got the VC in Gallipoli. And he saw so much carnage at Gallipoli that he decided, I want to be an officer myself. I know as well as these officers that are giving us these insane orders. The Brits said, no, we're looking for officers and gentlemen. You left school at Wedderburn at the age of 13, you can barely spell. And it was the great General Sir John Monash who said to the Brits, that's the way you do it, it's not the way we do it. He will be a fine officer, and he became a very fine officer. And so that's what the book is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Claire, last words to you on your book about the bark petitions.
Yeah, so I can't tell you about my next book because I need to have a big nap before that happens. I've just come back from a 2-month national book tour. I had my last events last weekend in Macedon. I've spent the last 2 months travelling all over the country, talking about this book, Naku Daruk, The Bark Petitions, which again took me 10 years to write. I was very much written in collaboration with the Yolngu people of Northeast Arnhem Land, whose community I was adopted into by the late Dr. Galaroi Yunupingu, whose name I'm allowed to use by family when I talk about the book. He unfortunately passed away last year. I think it's a story that more Australians should know. I think we should all know this story. These artefacts are in Parliament House. Many of the MPs who reside in Parliament House don't know what they are. It says very poor things about our democracy, that the importance, and I mentioned some of the importance of them, are so ill known. And it's a great story. It's set in 1963. The protagonists are Robert Menzies, a French mining company. It was the first time that the petitions that started what became the referendum in 1967, the constitutional referendum, that did win, that started that year. These incredible Yolngu people and the Methodist Overseas Mission, who were these amazing missionaries who totally defy our idea of mission history on the east coast of Australia. These missionaries were very much in support of protecting, keeping, encouraging and maintaining First Nations culture, Yolngu people's culture. Not only did they not stamp out language, but the missionaries themselves had to learn to speak the language themselves, and they were the ones who first came to the defence of the Yolngu people when their lands were invaded for mining, bauxite mining. Their lands were excised and lands were taken away without any consultation. So what these petitions to Parliament are, they actually aren't, in a sense, petitions. They were really the Yolngu people trying to speak from their nationhood to the Australian nation in a form of agreement making and diplomacy, asking for their laws to be respected, which is that when people came onto their land, they needed to ask for permission, they needed to get consent, and then they needed to compensate them for any resources that were taken off. That wasn't just white people, that was other Yolngu people, that was the Macassans from Sulawesi, that was Japanese pearl fishers. That Yolngu had been international traders well before the colony that was established in 1788. It's a deep time story, it's a story for our times, and it's been getting absolutely rave reviews. And the fact that it's really fat, and it's about something that sounds very complicated. It's actually been described as a whodunit. I know several people who have now read that big fat book in 3 days because they've said they just can't put it down.
Thank you both. It sounds like a fascinating book. Just before we conclude this evening, and I'll have some details about after the ceremony, I believe Council would like to present Peter and Clare with a gift of appreciation for their contribution tonight with the Peter Tobin oration. And I'll ask you to please thank Peter FitzSimons and Clare Wright.